Well, I certainly am delighted to be here. It's just such a thrill to finally get to see Arkansas. I've never been to Arkansas before, so what a wonderful state, a wonderful city. Yes, it's just a great place to be. And I hope I can share something about Thomas Jefferson that will inspire you and perhaps entice you to come to Monticello, but certainly give you a sense of what an incredible interest Jefferson had in gardening and nature. I wonder, is there a way to dim the lights at all, or maybe not? Maybe not, okay. And our own dear Monticello, where has nature spread so rich a mantle under the eye? Mountains, forests, rocks, rivers, with what majesty do we there ride above the storms? How sublime to look down into the workhouse of nature, to see her clouds, hail, snow, rain, thunder, all fabricated at our feet. And the glorious sun, when rising as if out of a distant water, just gilding the tops of the mountains and giving life to all nature. Well, certainly this passage from a letter that Jefferson wrote to his friend Maria Causeway in 1786 gives us a real sense of how special Monticello was to Thomas Jefferson. He was living in Paris at the time, and so he was very homesick and always longed to return to his little mountain. He kept, as Alan told you, he kept a garden diary, and he also wrote countless letters about his gardens throughout his lifetime. And these documents really help us to understand how deeply attached he was to his landscape and how involved he was in planning his gardens. He had a beautiful flower garden that ran along the west front of Monticello. He called this the garden front. And today we have that restored the way Jefferson had his plants situated along that path and in the oval beds. And in fact, Jefferson planned these gardens while he was still president. He was longing to retire and sent letters to his overseers and also to his granddaughters with directions and drawings about how he wanted his landscape to be arranged. Here you can see the west lawn that would really expand the number of flowers he could grow. And in this painting from 1825, just a year before his death, we also see that the gardening was a really intimate occupation for Jefferson, with his family, his granddaughters, his grandchildren playing in the lawn. And you can see that the house is not really that formal looking. In fact, it's a little bit weedy around the foreground, but it was still a place to observe plants, to record their growth, and to really change his gardens with his family, consulting him. He had an amazing vegetable garden. It ran 1,000 feet in length, 80 feet wide. If you come to Monticello today and look at that little pavilion in the middle, it's actually standing at the midpoint of the garden. And Jefferson grew over 330 different varieties of vegetables during his lifetime. It's just a remarkable place to observe the kinds of plants that were really interesting to him. And many of the vegetables, of course, were grown by few others in America. He was successful in growing many plants, but as you see in his garden diary, which he was, very honest with. If you read down that line, you'll see a lot of failures and failed on his list as well. So you can certainly relate to that, I'm sure. But these garden calendars are quite fascinating to study in their own right, because they show really how closely attached he was to his garden, especially after about 1812. Just a couple of vegetables that he grew in this garden included the globe artichoke, which he first listed this actually in the 1770s, long before he created this garden terrace. And he perennially planted artichokes and cultivated artichokes all the way up until 1825. In fact, this old world plant, or Mediterranean plant, is not that easy to grow in Virginia. And he wrote to his friend Madame de Tessé in 1805 saying that we can neither have figs nor artichokes without protection from the winter. I'm happy I put this in because I know this is a favorite of Alan's, the tomato. This is the Castelluto Genovese tomato. And Jefferson, many people, in fact, there's kind of an erroneous belief that Jefferson introduced tomatoes to America, and this is not true. People were growing them and eating them, but they were kind of considered poisonous among many cultures. But Jefferson was actually growing them in his garden beginning in 1809 all the way through to his death. And this Castelluto Genovese is an old Italian heirloom that really has the look of these ancient tomato varieties, which are New World, by the way, and with the deeply lobed and veined fruits. He also had an enormous fruit garden that extended below the vegetable garden terrace, and in it he had over 150 different varieties of fruits, ranging from peaches, apricots, plums, pears, apples, cherries, even some nut trees. He also had berry squares with figs and raspberries, gooseberries, and currants. And he had vineyards in his orchard, in his fruit garden. We don't believe Jefferson ever succeeded in bringing a bottle of wine to table from his vineyard, but he certainly attempted on many occasions. It was a bit of a frustration for him because he was a lover of fine wine, especially European wine, and he would drink a small glass with every dinner. He said that it encouraged conversation. So we can all relate to that, certainly. But he did everything in moderation. You know, he was not a vegetarian, but he did eat meat in moderation, and he said that meat should only be eaten as a condiment to your vegetables. So here we go. He was very revolutionary in that. Well, Jefferson only wrote one book in his lifetime, and it was, understandably, from my point of view, about the natural history of Virginia. And of course, in his day, Virginia was a much larger geographic location, really encompassing most of the mid-Atlantic states. But Notes on the State of Virginia was really written to refute an argument that was very popular, a theory that was very popular in Europe at that time, in the 1780s, that was being promoted, saying that the European plants immediately degenerated upon contact with the soil and climate of America. And Jefferson's book was really considered a literary classic and an intellectual landmark. It was the first comprehensive treatise on the topography, natural history, and natural resources of the United States, and it has been cited as one of the first masterpieces of American literature. While in Paris, Jefferson arranged for American specimens to be exported to Europe, including our grandest native trees and shrubs, to unequivocally prove his point. In a letter from Paris to Angelica Church, he even proclaimed that Europe is a first idea, a crude production, before the maker knew his trade or had made up his mind as to what he wanted. So these are really fighting words here we're going on. Well, Jefferson, his knowledge of botany, natural history, was so well respected in America that he was honored by the naming of a plant after him. This namesake, you might say, is called Jeffersonia diphylla, and the honor was given to Jefferson in 1792 before the American Philosophical Society. And it was made by a very well-known botanist in his day, Benjamin Smith Barton. And he said that he named this plant after Jefferson not for his political aspirations, but for his knowledge of botany and natural history. And he said that his knowledge was equal by that of few others in America. And here is the plant in the flesh, you might say. Its common name, twin leaf, is very apropos because you can see the foliage looks like little butterfly wings. And it's an ephemeral. Wouldn't you know it would be a very difficult plant to propagate. You have to collect seed and sow them immediately. It takes about a year before it even germinates, and about 5 years before you get a blooming plant. And then it goes completely dormant in the summer because it's an ephemeral. But it is a native, and one that's very worthwhile growing if you can get it established in your garden. It looks a lot like a bloodroot. Well, I came here to talk about roses, and so without beating around the bush too much, I do want to kind of move toward that focus now. And Jefferson, of course, wrote so many wonderful things about plants in his lifetime, but he's a little bit sparse on roses, at least early on in his life. In fact, we have to go to his birth site at Shadwell across the Ravenna River to find references to his first planting of roses. And he wrote in 1767 that he planted suckers of roses and seeds of Althea and princess feather, as well as sweet peas and dianthus. So suckers of roses, that's all we have to go on here. But we can pretty much surmise what he might have been talking about at that time. And in fact, suckering roses included such roses as the apothecary's rose, Rosa gallica officinalis, which was a venerable garden plant with a long history, having originated before the time of the ancient Romans. And the early herbalists listed it as a source of flavoring and medicine, such as rosewater, preserves, and potpourri. It was considered a common and useful plant in American gardens as early as the 17th century. And the plants bear large semi-double flowers, deep rose-colored, and with a prominent central cluster of golden stamens. It is also known as the red rose of Lancaster and the double French rose. Well, another suckering rose that might have been among his list of plants planted at Shadwell could have been the cinnamon rose with a beautiful, again, it's only a once blooming rose, just like the apothecaries, but it has beautiful red, kind of a burgundy red colored stems. Well, Jefferson's next reference to planting of roses we find in 1771 when he was beginning to create his landscape at Monticello. At that time, he really hadn't done much to build the house, but he was already planning the entire mountain in the way it would be planted. And he wanted to plant shrubberies on the north slope of the mountain, a very steep area where you couldn't farm. And on that side, he wanted to have shrubbery not exceeding growth of 10 feet. Sweetbriar, he says. Sweetbriar, wonderful. We've got a name, finally. He also planted some native shrubs, of course, but including the wild honeysuckle and the American calicarpa. But the sweetbriar rose was a European rose, and so he did introduce some non-natives into this shrubbery. And it's really a lovely rose, but again, only once blooming. It's distinguished by the apple scent of its foliage, which when you rub it in the fresh young leaves, they really have a lovely fragrance. It's just a single flower, not too showy, but it has very long-lasting hips. Well, later in 1782 now, we're moving along. This is the year Jefferson's wife died, so it was a very tragic year for him, but he was consoling himself by making observations about his garden during that year. And in May, he kept a calendar of the blooming of flowers, and one of the flowers he mentioned was the crimson dwarf rose. Again, a dwarf rose at that time could have been another type of cenifolia, such as this pom-pom de Bourgogne, which was available at that time. It was also called the Burgundian rose. Very, very double flowers. But then Jefferson traveled to France in 1786, and he was serving as minister to France at the time, and he traveled around the country observing gardens both around Paris, but also in England. One of his friends was Maria Cosway that I mentioned earlier. She was an artist, and they met each other and would walk through gardens such as the Place de Saint Cloud, where they probably took their first walk together. And then he took that famous trip that, this is sort of a salute to Alan, and his trip to England with John Adams. And this, as Alan alluded, was a whirlwind trip of visiting all sorts of gardens. They traveled with a garden book, the Observations on Modern Gardening by Whately, which was a popular guide at that time especially to visiting tourists to the area. And that's just a few of the sites they visited included Blenheim, Hampton Court, Roses might have been there, Chiswick, and Payne's Hill, which really had a lot of native plants from North America in it. They wanted to create, it was very popular at that time to create American gardens in England. Well, there's only one mention of roses during that time period, and it was a list of plants that Jefferson sent to Francis Epps, and it just said roses of various kinds. So included with the roses, he had seeds of heliotrope and amaranths, such as Joseph's coat. But roses of various kinds. Well, there's probably about 50 different types of roses that were available in the 1780s. So they could have been such as this particular rose, another cenifolia called Rose de Meaux. Nice French name. Well, then we move back to America. He returns home. And in 1791, Jefferson made a very important excursion with his friend, James Madison. In that year, Jefferson was Secretary of State under George Washington, and he was embroiled in various political and personal matters. His ideological vision for America was in conflict with the governmental system espoused by Alexander Hamilton and was causing political relationships to crumble, and his already strained friendship with John Adams continued to deteriorate. Consequently, Jefferson's month-long botanizing excursion through New England with James Madison in June of that year was the subject of much speculation. Hamilton and other political adversaries were convinced that this lengthy vacation of two Republican Virginians through Federalist strongholds in the North had secret ulterior motives. It would seem likely that, as Jefferson historian Merrill Peterson surmised, while the two future presidents bounced along in leisurely fashion, their conversation must have turned occasionally to politics. Yet apparently the trip was innocent of intrigue and intended exclusively for, in Madison's words, health, recreation, and curiosity. This goal was successfully achieved, for both Jefferson's periodical migraines and Madison's bilious attacks, whatever that is, vanished in the nearly 4 weeks they spent walking over historic battlefields, studying botanical curiosities, wildlife and insects, and recording observations on climate, the seasons, and the appearance of birds, and even boating and fishing in Lake George and Lake Champlain. Well, I just wanted to kind of indulge in reading you that little passage to just give you a sense of, you know, how much Jefferson always longed to just get out of the office and get out in nature. I mean, I can truly relate to the man in so many ways, but that in particular speaks to me. Well, on their return trip, they made a significant detour to a very important nursery, the Prince Family Nursery on Long Island. And here, Jefferson was actually, his primary interest was to obtain sugar maples, trying to create his own sugar maple grove at Monticello, or a sugar-producing grove at Monticello. But he also ended up making an enormous list of plants that he wanted to have sent to Monticello in the fall. This was in July when they visited. So his order, among his orders, included a very large list of flowers. So, you know, this is a catalog in Jefferson's day. You know, you've got to really, you don't have the color pictures, you don't, you know, you have to really think about what you're looking at. But here's the list of roses that was available from the Prince Nursery. And Jefferson went down that list and he ordered 3 each of every single rose on the list. So 30 roses in total he wanted to have sent to Monticello. In the fall, November 8th, Jefferson received 2 each of all of the roses that he ordered, which again, we might be able to relate to whenever we aren't able to get plants. Even though we want them, they've run out. But at least he did receive them all. And this is a very significant list because it pretty much encompasses all that was available in America at this time in the 1790s. The Provence rose was on the list, and the Provence rose was actually the cabbage rose. Rosa centifolia means many-leaved or many-petaled, actually. So it's a rose that has an enormous head of flowers on it, so tightly packed that you do not even see any stamens in it. And the moss rose was a kind of an aberration of the centifolia rose with very soft prickles on the buds, and they are very fragrant too. They have a lovely pine scent to them. And the moss rose is a real favorite of ours at Monticello because of that. And it was very, very popular. These roses became very popular on into the Victorian period. In fact, when you see these old calling cards from the mid-19th century, you see they're all depicting moss roses, that little mossing on the buds and the upper part of the stem. He also received what was called a primrose, which was probably some sort of Rosa spinosissima, or as it's called now, the pimpinellifolia. Here we have a yellow form. There's also white. And he did order the yellow rose, which was likely the yellow Rosa foetida that brought the yellow coloring from the East to our roses today. And the wonderful Rosa mundi. This again is another sport of the Rosa gallica with very fragrant striped blossoms that really have a striking mixture of white and red. It's probably the oldest and best known of the striped roses. It originated in Europe and has a long history in our gardens. Many legends surround this rose. The most romantic is that it was named for fair Rosamond, mistress of Henry II. But more likely, the name refers to the universal appeal of this variety, hence the name Rose of the World. And here we see it in this Robert Ferber print of roses that would be in bloom in England in June. His first prints came out in 1731. This is a reprint of it from 1745. But as you can see, these roses were all available in Europe quite early on in this painting. And you're probably very familiar with these paintings because they've been reproduced so many times. You see them in hotel lobbies everywhere. Here's another Rosa centifolia without the mossing and in the flesh. And our Musk Rose, the white rose that I'm going to talk more about when I'm getting into the noisettes in a bit, but this was another important rose that Jefferson obtained from the Prince Nursery. Here's a single form. There's single, double, semi-double forms of the Musk Rose. Sometimes they all occur on one plant. It's a very variable plant. It's very unusual. Cinnamon rose that I mentioned earlier. And another primrose. And the Alpine, I'm sorry, that was the Alpine Rose. And an Alpine Rose was a thornless rose. It's another unusual rose. And all of these roses were meant to be planted around the lilacs that Jefferson had planted, and you know, this is before the final version of his garden that went in 1806 to 1809. So this would have been in a different area at Monticello, probably on the east front. Jefferson also obtained a rose from a governor in Georgia, Governor Millage. Maybe you've heard of Milledgeville in Georgia. And this was seeds that were sent to him of what is actually the Cherokee rose. It was Jefferson planted it in his nursery. He obtained these seeds and struck them in the ground in 1804. But it's actually an Asian species, even though it was believed to be North American. It naturalized so abundantly that by 1803, Michaud identified it as a native rose in the South. And in fact, I believe it is the state rose of Georgia, even though it's actually from China. So Jefferson had this. And he was also growing more roses and collecting roses for his friend, Madame de Tessé. Now, this was another lady friend that Jefferson had, and this is the aunt of Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette. And she was also a great gardener, and he very much admired her because she cultivated trees in her old age, which Jefferson said he was wont to just become a florist when he retired. Didn't have time to wait for all those trees to grow up. But he sent her a number of our native roses. In 1802, he asked Robert Bailey to procure seeds and plants below mentioned, as this may not be out of your line, and the plants abound in the neighborhood. I will ask the favor of you to make the collection and pack them well and properly for the sea, labeling each article so substantially as not to be erased. You imagine how hard it was to send something over to Europe. The sooner they are ready, the better. Should you not have the convenience of having the boxes made, and will send me a note of the sizes, they shall be made here. And then he asked him to collect wild roses of every kind, a half bushel each. Imagine, half bushel of seed of all of these roses. These are just the Carolina rose and the Virginia rose. They're our native roses. And then he had another lady friend that also mentions roses and her remembrances of Jefferson. And this is quite an interesting lady in her own right, Mrs. Samuel Harrison Smith, or as we call Margaret Bayard Smith. Her husband was a newspaper editor, actually, in Washington. And she was kind of a Washington socialite. And she just loved Thomas Jefferson. I mean, everything waxes poetic when she talks about Jefferson. And in one of her remembrances, she talks about Jefferson's life in the president's house. In those days, it was not called the White House, as you know. It was the president's house. And she wrote this: "In the window recesses were stands for the flowers and plants which was his delight to attend, and among his roses and geraniums was suspended the cage of his favorite mockingbird. How he loved this bird." His bird's name was Dick, by the way, if you didn't know that. "How he loved his flowers. He could not live without something to love, and in the absence of his darling grandchildren, his birds and his flowers became objects of tender care." And indeed, Jefferson did love the mockingbird, and he brought them all back with him, his pet mockingbirds, back to Monticello when he retired. But in this passage, she did mention roses, didn't she? And obviously they were indoors, they were in his cabinet. So one likelihood would be one of the dwarf China roses. So again, we surmise that this might have been one of the possibilities in pots in the president's house. The Parsons pink china, Rosa chinensis pallida, or Rosa chinensis sempervirens. And these roses, as we'll find out, are really parents of our noisette class of roses. At another point, she mentions that she sent him plants of the black rose. Again, we have to guess what that might be, but it was probably the Tuscany rose, a beautiful, deep, deep red rose that's almost like velvet. And again, this would likely be a rose that could have been sent to Jefferson in 1808. Well, Jefferson retires to Monticello, and he also plans another retreat home because he knew, like George Washington, that once he retired from his, the presidency, he would be inundated with visitors wanting to see him, you know, fans. In fact, it was just kind of overwhelming for this very shy, reclusive man. Jefferson really did like to retire from from the public for many ways. And so he began building a retreat home in Poplar Forest, and this was really about 70 miles away from Monticello near Lynchburg. And it was a beautiful house, an octagonal shape, and in many ways it sort of reflected the way in which the landscape, at least, reflected the way in which the Washington landscape was laid out. It's very formal, unlike those gardens at Monticello, and he had some interesting plans for his. Now these plantings are on mounds. The round areas are on mounds that were on the opposite side of privies, and then rows of trees. But right in here, he also planned to have Alba roses planted in these oval beds. And the Alba rose is, again, a very ancient rose, and its antiquity goes back to at least the time of the Romans, and even Pliny, who lived from 23 AD, mentions white roses in his Natural History. And botanists believe these roses may have been the Albas. Well, I want to talk now a little bit on a different line, because we have a lot of plants collected now at the Thomas Jefferson Center for Historic Plants, which is a program associated with Monticello that really strives to collect and preserve historic plants and make them available to the public in various ways, for sale, of course, but also through education, telling people what and the importance of these plants are in history. And some of the collection includes many plants that were discovered or located in neighborhoods that we're still trying to identify, including a Banshee Rose that was found in a neighborhood near where I live, which is, the Banshee Roses are an interesting class of roses that were probably a hybrid between a damask and a Rosa virginiana. We go to cemeteries and look for roses all the time. Here on the left is Shaler's Provence from the UVA cemetery. And then on the right is a Noisette Rose in the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. And this Noisette, we've just given a study name because we're not really sure exactly which one it is, but the gentleman pointing to this rose has been very instrumental in helping us to establish our Noisette garden. This is Doug Seidel, and he was a protege of Leonie Bell. Leonie Bell died in 1996, but she was an incredible rosarian and a author and illustrator, and it was her work that really led to the rediscovery of many rose varieties today. Here's another rose in a cemetery, the Safrano, showing how old these roses can go back to. If you could see the trunk of this, it's really enormous. But many of these roses still exist on headstones in various gardens. This one is a rose that came from a cemetery associated with the Epps family, and Jefferson's daughter Mary John Epps, and so it almost has a connection to Jefferson, but again, we don't have a positive identification on it, so we just call it the Millbrook Rose from where it came from. Well, I mentioned the Musk Rose earlier as one of the roses Jefferson obtained from the Prince Nursery, and this rose again has a long history, but what is very remarkable about it is that it was almost lost to cultivation during the 20th century. There were imposter roses that kind of looked like the Musk Rose, and people were growing them. One was Brunonii, which was a climber from Japan that really was not the Musk Rose at all, but it was being labeled as the Musk Rose. And we understand, of course, in gardening, the problems with mislabeling plants, and this was a serious loss. And so people began to look for this rose in various places. And in fact, Leonie Bell should be credited with leading the charge, even Graham Stewart Thomas was not aware that this rose was endangered until she brought this fact to his attention. And so, of course, he kind of gets credit for it because he's a big rose guy in England. But there was this little woman from Philadelphia who put the bug in his ear, you might say. And this is one that was found, a very significant one that was found on the gravestone in Hollywood Cemetery, which is in Richmond, about an hour away from Monticello. And you can see it was growing on the graveside from the mid-19th century, about 1860s, was the first burial on that plot. It was the Crenshaw family plot. And this is a very important rose because it had single, double, and semi-double flowers all on one plant. And it's enormous. As you can see, it's over 12 feet tall. And the Musk Rose was also a very fragrant rose, and that's something to remember as we talk about the noisettes. Well, I actually, along with Doug Seidel, discovered an even more significant rose, we believe, on the plantation of John Hartwell Cock, who was a contemporary of Jefferson's, a friend of Jefferson's. He had a beautiful Palladian style home inspired by Jefferson on the James River. And here he is, the general. He did live, he was a young man when he knew Jefferson, and then he lived to around this time of the Civil War. But his home he called Bremo. And Bremo had, on this estate, or this plantation, he had 3 separate buildings. The largest was the Palladian style home that you see here. But also on the property was a little structure where he first lived called the Recess. And the Recess still stands, and it's privately owned. This whole estate is still in private hands. And there was a woman living here who was actually a direct descendant from John Hartwell Cock. And she's kind of bent over in this picture. You'll see her here. Her name is Frances Orff. And she was a great-great-granddaughter of the general. And she said that her great-grandmother and grandmother always made a big fuss over the roses that they claimed the general had planted. And Frances Orff was just a lovely woman, and we did a lot of oral histories with her to record this plant because it's actually still living on this property. And through the help of some research, we discovered that the rose was likely part of an order that John Hartwell Cock made in 1815. So it predates that Hollywood Cemetery rose by about a half a century. And it's still growing, but in a very neglected, very endangered site. This garden is very overgrown, and there's really hardly anyone taking care of it. Well, Mrs. Frances actually has died since this time, but her memories were recorded, and we propagated from that plant. We have a beautiful specimen of the Musk Rose at Monticello today. It's really enormous. It's just starting to bloom. And I wrote a little story about it in a magazine I formerly edited for the Center for Historic Plants called Twin Leaf. And I talked about the discovery of this Musk Rose, and it caught the attention of a National Public Radio reporter named Martha Woodruff, who lives out of Harrisonburg, Virginia. And so she wanted to do a big story on this rose. So she came and interviewed me, and we went back and retraced the Bremo Musk, and we went to Hollywood Cemetery. We interviewed Marie Butler, who was also a friend of Leonie Bell's and a friend of Ruth Knopp, and probably got 5 hours of taping for this segment that got whittled down to about a 5-minute program that was going to be aired on National Public Radio. And we were really anticipating this with much excitement. And it was all set to air on September 11th, 2001. And so obviously people were, all of these sort of human interest stories were not very interesting for a long time after that. But the story did surface, percolate up 2 months to the day later, on December 11th, 2001. They actually aired this story, and it was such a delight for us, and it even caught the attention of a descendant of a person who, from the Crenshaw family. He practically had a wreck on the highway when he heard the whole story about it, and called us up immediately. So it really brought a lot of connections to us. Well, the Musk Rose is very important in its own right, but it's even more important for us today and for the garden that Alan is developing, because it was part of the parentage of the Noisette roses. And the Musk Rose actually was being cultivated on the plantation home of John Champneys in Charleston, South Carolina in the early 1800s. And nearby, he had another rose, a newly introduced China rose called Old Blush, and they like to call this the China stud roses. There were 4 of them that were introduced from China, and they brought I guess the male genes. I don't know, but anyway, that rose was growing nearby, and we're not sure if he intentionally crossed it or if it happened by chance. But the thing about the China roses, they weren't fragrant, but they were repeat bloomers, and this was a new quality that people did not really enjoy during this time. And so when these 2 roses crossed, their offspring after their marriage was a rose that John Champneys recognized as being quite significant. And oh, here's another blush China, and another. Sorry about that. But he called this offspring the Champneys Pink Cluster. And it had the qualities of fragrance, ever-blooming, clusters of pale pink and white flowers, and it was a very good rose for the South, but it's quite hardy all the way up at least to Philadelphia that we know of. So he named it the Champneys Pink Cluster after himself, and which is highly understandable. He shared these plants with the Prince Nursery up in Long Island, and he also shared plants with his neighbor, Philippe Noisette. Now, here's that name. And Philippe was also he had just immigrated to America from Paris, and his brother still lived in Paris, and his name was Louis. And Philippe actually sent some of these plants back to his brother as a significant rose, and his brother also recognized that it had some great qualities. So he began crossing the Noisette with other roses, and his first rose was the Blush Noisette, which you see in the painting on the left by Pierre-Joseph Redoutey. And Redoutey painted all of the roses in the Empress Josephine's garden, and she had many noisettes in her garden. She wanted to have every rose, she's sort of like Alan Smith here, she wanted to have every rose in the world in her garden. And she had this wonderful painter who documented them for us very beautifully. And I can't tell you how important these are to us when we study old roses, and really old plants of all sorts. Well, it occurred to us through the encouragement of Doug Seidel that we should have a garden designated to the story of the Noisette, because indeed, even though it had this lovely French name, it was the first American rose hybrid. And it also occurred during Jefferson's lifetime. We're not sure Jefferson actually had noisettes, but he could have, because they were coming into cultivation in the 18-teens. So we constructed a beautiful garden based on the many plants that Doug Seidel had in his collections, and also some of the plants from Leonie Bell's collection. After she died, there was a great concern that many of her plants that she had been collecting throughout her life would be lost. And so it was important to find a place, and Doug felt that the Center for Historic Plants was just the right location to house these roses. A friend, Alan Brown, did a beautiful design for us based on the octagon, Jefferson's favorite form. And in the garden, we not only have the noisette hybrids, but also some of the parents. This is one that our friend Ruth Knopf discovered called, we've given it a study name Redoute Red because it looks just like one of the Redoute paintings of a Rosa chinensis sempervirens. This is a drawing that was made by Mrs. Keyes, another very important person in rose history in America, who had discovered this rose as a descendant from a rose that was collected, actually preserved by a slave after she was freed after the Civil War in Maryland. And this freed slave was growing this rose in her garden, and it was passed down through her family. And Mrs. Keyes, who was in the early 20th century garden writer, collected cuttings from that rose and preserved it. And she named it the Faded Pink Monthly. And we actually have the original plant from Mrs. Keyes' garden in the garden at the Center for Historic Plants. And it's a really beautiful rose, very fully double and large. It's a large flower. Another one of the noisettes is Narrow Waters, which I just particularly like the grace and the form of this plant. They all grow into shrubs. Some of them are climbers, but most of them are roses that grow about 6 or 8 feet tall. This one was named after the ill-fated President Garfield's aunt, Louisa, from her Ohio garden. Again, it resembles somewhat the Faded Pink Monthly, but it's quite unique in its own right. And just some of the people that have helped us along the way. I mentioned Doug Seidel, he's here, and Ruth Knopf, who also has played a big role in establishing some of the roses in Allen's garden. And she may come here. You might get a chance to meet her someday. She's very shy, doesn't like to speak in public, but you might get to meet her. She's great. Stephen Scaniello at the top, he's kind of a noted rose gardener as well, but he's from the Brooklyn area, so we'll just talk about Southerners for today. But and so I want to close now with just a little remark about from a book that very much inspired the Center for Historic Plants when we first established it back in 1987. And the book is by David Stewart and James Sutherland, called Plants from the Past. And they talk about the importance of saving these old heirloom plants. And I quote, "Even the most modern garden can be full of history. Any gardener can grow plants bred by the artisans of 18th century England, admired by the princes of Renaissance Italy, or collected in the Himalayas for Victorian millionaires. Hundreds of plant genera, which play important roles in the garden scene, have long and fascinating histories. The gorgeous antiques of the garden are every bit as important as our more obvious antiques, like furnishings, paintings, even houses. And they are just as much a part of our past, yet many of them are in danger of extinction." And so, more than anything, I think that's why we really owe our own heritage the fact that we do try to preserve many of these historic plants to tell our story into the future. Thank you very much. I have no idea how long I talked, but you know, if anyone wants to ask questions or if you just need to leave or whatever, that's fine. Okay. Right here? Yeah. Okay. There's a gentleman in the back raising his hand.
Are you all working with Poplar Forest on the garden restoration down there?
Somewhat. I mean, some members of our staff are on an advisory board for Poplar Forest, and I've visited the site many times. In fact, we even grew some tulip poplars from seeds that they collected from their trees on the site, and last year I went down with a couple of my friends at the center to plant these trees on the site at Poplar Forest. So we do have a connection. It's not as real constant, but it's certainly they're part of what we're doing at Monticello. Thank you. Right here, right there.
Do you have to spray the historic roses like you do the modern ones?
They do require some care. It's good to fertilize them annually, and some of them will get black spot. The China roses do bring black spot into the equation, you might say, and but not all of them. So I think if you just groom them well and do a lot of clean culture, you know, rake up fallen leaves and that sort of thing, you can really avoid a lot of those problems. They don't need a lot of heavy pruning. You just want to maybe cut out dead or that sort of thing. But basically, we spray very minimally, as needed, you might say. Good question.
Question right back here, yes.
Oh.
Is your catalog online now?
Yes, it is. You can go to monticello.org and kind of wind your way through the website. It's got a lot of stuff on it, so just be patient. And you can go to this, read more about the Center for Historic Plants and shop online, not only plants, but also seeds.
Bill Worthen's got a question behind you, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you. He was fascinated, Jefferson was, with the West, and I know
Yes.
he brought back many items from the West, including Bodark from Arkansas.
Right, you're right. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Did he plant many of these things from the West, and how did they do at Monticello?
Yes, and, that's a whole nother lecture. You need to invite me back for that one. But yes, he did. I don't think he planted the Bodark at Monticello, but he planted, he was president, of course, at the time, so he was a little bit preoccupied. But when they sent back seeds and plants, he did share them with his friends. Bernard McMahon in Philadelphia, William Hamilton were two important people that he shared these plants with, and they grew things on and then sent them back to Jefferson. McMahon, for example, sent Jefferson young plants of the snowberry bush, which is kind of related to our Indian currant that grows here, but it came from the West. And also Mahonia aquifolium, the Oregon grape holly, were just two examples. Jefferson also grew vegetables that were sent back, beans from the Native Americans. The Arikara bean and the Mandan corn were a couple of vegetables that he was trying to cultivate. And so, yeah, some of them did well, some of them probably didn't at all. So,
Any more questions? Well, let's give Peggy a round of applause.
thank you.